Hi, good afternoon all. I'm Lawrence Hamilton, and thanks so much for coming to the revived 2022 version of the SA UK Bilateral Chair in Political Theories Lunchtime seminar series. And I think we have at least two things to celebrate today. First of all, that after a 2-year hiatus, we can revive this series, which I and I hope all of you are very happy about. And secondly, that we have one of our local stars, at least on the television and beyond, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, talking today on In Search of the Good Life in Democratic South Africa. Dr. Mbete is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria. She's a director of the programs at Future Elect, and she's a research assistant at King's College, University of London, in the African Leadership Centre. As many of you will know, at least those in South Africa, she's on TV nearly every night. If you watch the news, I won't give you all of the channels she appears on, but I come across her all the time on Newsroom Africa, so that seems like a favorite. Prior to the position she holds now, she worked in the presidency. She was a researcher in the Secretariat of the National Planning Commission. She was involved in drafting the National Development Plan. She worked as a researcher at IDASA, the Institute for Democracy in South Africa. And she has also worked with the Right to Know campaign, helping to coordinate activism around that legislation, or around the legislation that emanated from that. So I'm sure you are all happy to welcome Sithembile to speak to us today about the good life, or at least the search for it, in democratic South Africa. Sithembile.
Use this or this one. Can I use this one instead?
I don't trust that one.
Thanks for that really generous welcome. Hi everyone who's in the room. Hello everyone who's online. It is a great pleasure to be here speaking to you. And because this isn't a kind of government function, I don't have to do all the protocols or protocol observed, etc., etc. I was very excited when I was asked to speak here in this lecture series. I think we've been trying to do it since 2020, so it's great to finally be able to come and speak here at BITS. And when I initially was asked in January, I wanted, because of Lawrence's chair in political theory, and at the moment my being involved in kind of applied politics stuff, working with aspirant political leaders. Is this sound cool? With aspirant political leaders, I thought, okay, this is a great opportunity to just delve into sort of theoretical things in political thought and really engage with this idea, this Aristotelian idea of the good life, and a critique I've kind of been playing with in my mind that and taken a bit from some of Lawrence's work, but also from some of the work of Prof. Friedman, Stephen Friedman, Aubrey Machiter as well, and the work that he's done, around the idea that the transition from apartheid to democracy didn't go really far beyond the attainment of democratic rights, or really just the right to vote for the majority. But there was no real engagement with the economic structures, with the social life of South Africa, and what that would look like in a fully inclusive society. And so, the way Stephen Friedman puts it, it was decided the elites on both sides accepted that what a democratic South Africa would do is it would apply the quality of life that white people had under apartheid to everyone, and that would be success. Except that's not possible. Because the quality of life that was enjoyed by whites in South Africa under apartheid and under colonialism was only possible because of the oppression and the subjugation of a majority of people. The kind of life where you would have a big house and a swimming pool and domestic help if you were a policeman was only ever attainable in South Africa. And it was only ever attainable in South Africa because you had 100% of the, you had 80% of the resources going to at most 12% of the population. And so any attempt to expand that to using 100% of the resources for 100% of the population would not yield the quality of life that whites enjoyed under apartheid, and was only going to lead to disappointment. And what it also was going to do is that you would then de-racialize, so you remove the racial barriers for enjoying that lifestyle. So the top of people that would enjoy their lifestyle would be relatively de-racialized, but all the people who would be excluded from that lifestyle would still be Black. And we still have that situation now, where you've got some Black people that are able to live a lifestyle that was enjoyed by whites under apartheid, but the vast majority of the country, and pretty much 100% Black, and of that majority of people who don't enjoy that lifestyle, pretty much all of them are Black people. So I wanted to, and I think that it's time for us to have a think, to really rethink those assumptions of CODESA. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. And that's what I agreed to talk about in January. And then life happened. And in the past month or so, I've become increasingly concerned with the lack of public discussion about the electoral reform efforts that are currently underway in Parliament. And I think that the lack of discussion, the lack of public consultation is deliberate. And so I thought, well, let me use this platform to engage with that, and beginning from the premise that no attempt to change the current socioeconomic malaise that we're in as a country can happen if our political institutions continue to be monopolized by political elites. And we have an opportunity with these efforts currently around the electoral system and changing the Electoral Act to intervene in really democratizing our political system, and that should really be a task that occupies all of us, certainly who are involved in academia and civil society who are interested in these things, but it should also be something that occupies ordinary South Africans as a whole. And so that is what I'm going to be talking about today. It's a very long introduction, but an explanation about what gets me here to talking about this subject. And because it appears to me that we have in South Africa experiencing a crisis of representative democracy in the post-colonial state that is the Republic of South Africa. And what I mean by this is that, so firstly, we are operating in a global context of a rising wave of authoritarian regimes where democracy doesn't seem to be working for anyone. Even those so-called consolidated, established democracies of the West are really to maintain democratic norms and values and to continue the legitimacy and the credibility of the democratic system within their societies. So the situation with Donald Trump in the United States, and the fact that there are still people in the US that think that Joe Biden is not the president, pray to God to restore Donald Trump as the true president of the United States. We've just seen on Monday Viktor Orban re-elected to the presidency of Hungary by a significant margin, really entrenching his power in that country. And then, of course, the war that we're seeing in Ukraine, and the real confident and entrenchment of authoritarian rule in Russia. So what we're seeing is not unique to South Africa. And certainly what we're seeing is a manifestation of the tensions that are natural or that are inherent in the idea of representative democracy itself. There have been 200 years of debates about how you square the idea of democracy as ruled by the people for the people, and the idea that people elect people to represent them, elect effectively an elite that represents them and makes decisions on their behalf. This idea of the dilution of democracy through representation is something that has occupied political thinkers for centuries now. And I think that we are seeing a manifestation of that in South Africa. And so those general concerns and tensions of democracy that are experienced not just in South Africa, but in many other places, are then combined with the crisis of South Africa as a post-colonial state and as a settler colony that's still grappling with ideas of citizenship. Who actually belongs in South Africa? Who has the rights of citizenship? What do those rights entail? The kinds of things we're seeing now with Operation Dudula and all of that is a real question of belonging and citizenship. Who has the rights to the benefits that come with being a citizen of a given polity, in our case, being a citizen of South Africa. Mungile Nzebeza, sociologist at UC, has written extensively about traditional authority and the kinds of awkward ways in which traditional authority has been included and is treated within the democratic regime that was established in 1994, and the kind of bifurcated citizenship that it creates for rural populations, building, and not building on, but tied in that way to the work of Mahmoud Nabdani, with his work on citizens and subjects. Professor Tsepo Madlingozi, who's written extensively around and critically of the kind of neoliberal state that was born after 1994, particularly after 1996, and the way it undermines the citizenship of ordinary people. And Nomboli Sokasa, who's written around traditional courts bill, the wanting to formalize a form of traditional justice that then creates two levels of citizenship for urban and rural citizens. You've also had writers like Prof. Tibin Reddy, Prof. Friedman, writing around the insider-outsider characteristic of South African democracy, that there is a small proportion of the population that is included and actively engaged in the formal processes of democracy, in elections, that has access to the participatory mechanisms of democracy, and that can therefore reap the benefits of all of those. And then there's a significantly larger proportion of the population that's excluded and that needs to exercise democratic participation informally through protest, through protest particularly, but in other ways of organizing outside of those formal processes, because the formal democratic system does not include them. And then we have, as a feature of this crisis of representation, the declining legitimacy of electoral politics, the work that's been done by Lauren Tracy Tember at the ISS on youth perspectives on democracy, on voting in 2014, 2016, and I think in 2019, really showing that young people don't see the point of participating formally, of voting, because it doesn't lead to anything, it doesn't change anything. And all they see is the recycling of elites the continuation of the same problems that they've always had, and the continuation of their exclusion. Just after the 2019 elections, Colette Schultz-Hartzenberg did an analysis on non-voters in South Africa, finding a really interesting trend that you have a smaller and smaller proportion of young people are turning out to vote in any election. And what that means is that because the largest part of the voting age, the largest demographic of the voting age population in South Africa is between the ages of 18 and 35. If you use the IEC's demarcations, let's say 18 and 39. In 2009, around 67% of that demographic was registered to vote. By 2019, that had fallen to the low 50s. And so what it means is that voting age people, or the biggest demographic of voting age people, are getting less and less involved in the electoral system, which is an explanation for why our participation rates keep declining. In 2021, 12 million people turned out to vote. That was the lowest voter turnout that we've ever had as a country. Was 46%. 12 million people turned out to vote, as opposed to 15 million people, over 15 million people that turned out to vote in the 2016 local government election. And a significant contributor to that is that the demographic between 18 and 29 in particular just did not vote, they're not registered to vote, and they don't turn out to vote. And we know from the literature on democratic participation that if somebody starts voting young, the likelihood of them being a lifelong voter is much higher because you build the habit of voting. So if you can't get your 18 to 19-year-olds to register to vote, and once they've registered, to turn out to vote, it means that the prospects of growing your electoral participation into the future are significantly diminished. Recent research from the Afrobarometer paper written by Musa and Hoffmeyer from last year, based on Afrobarometer survey that was taken in June, so it was before the July unrest, showed that South Africans don't trust political institutions. Even the trust of the IEC, which of all institutions involved in democracy, had always been matched at the highest. The trust in the IEC has dropped to 36%. The trust in political parties is below 30%. And the most concerning thing to me about that research and about the findings of that survey is that 67% of the respondents said that they would be willing to live with a non-elected government. So they'd be willing to give up elections if it meant housing, jobs, and security. Democracy is no longer seen as legitimate or credible in this country. The majority of that, 67%, if you disaggregate it, were young people. So it was particularly amongst young urban people that a dissatisfaction with democracy was most acute. And it's in this context that you've had then that you had in 2020 the Constitutional Court making the judgment in the case brought forward by the New Nation movement. And the court ruled that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional insofar as it excludes individuals from running for office as individuals and not in political parties. And this judgment was handed down on the 11th of June of 2020, and they gave the National Assembly until the 10th of June of 2022 to amend the Electoral Act to correct that unconstitutionality so that that new amended legislation could be used in 2024. And that is where, that's how I'm locating my talk. It's going to be talking about what then has come since that judgment. A bit of background stuff. I assume that many of the people here know, but I'm just getting some terms out because I'm going to be using them quite a lot in the next few slides. You can basically class electoral systems into three broad family types. A plurality and majority, which basically the most common one of those is the first past the post system, which is what we have at ward level, where you have people running in single member constituencies. The person with the most votes wins. In that kind of plurality system. In some cases, you have a majority system where the person with 50% plus one wins in that particular constituency, but there are many variations of that same kind of system. Its advantages that it's simple, it's direct accountability because of constituencies, and it's been said to yield unstable governments. But of course, the disadvantages is that the votes that there's a lot of wasted votes. If you vote for the candidate that lost, your votes are discarded. The drawing of electoral boundaries can be really political, and it can lead to anomalous results where a party that wins less than 50% of the vote can get more than 50% of the seats in a legislature. Proportional representation is the system that we have in South Africa. Our national and provincial government system is the purest proportional representation system in the world. Closed list PR system where people vote for parties. Each of those parties compiles a list of candidates from the one candidate that they prefer the most to the candidate that they want the least to be in a legislature, and people just vote for the party with and then the seats are distributed amongst the parties according to the proportion of the vote that they have won. Our system is, the reason I say it is the most pure or it's the most strictly proportional representation of all the systems in the world, is that we have the lowest threshold for participating in the election, for getting a seat in parliament. So if you consider that there's 400 seats in parliament, you only need 0.25% of the vote to win a seat in parliament. And so the threshold to get a seat in parliament is actually very low. And parties have complete discretion in compiling their lists. You think about it, every vote counts, it's simple, it's inclusive. And unlike what the DA likes to tell people, every vote actually does, there are no lost votes, because every vote that is cast can contribute to the seat calculation, which is why you've got parties like Al Jamaa and AIC in parliament. And in any other difference, if votes were really wasted in our system, those parties wouldn't get in. But the system is designed for maximum inclusion of AIC is no longer there, it's ATN that is different. That's the new AIC did give a seat to the water. It's ATN that managed to get, I think it's 2 seats in parliament in 2019. It also is the best system actually for women's participation, because parties have complete control over the seats that they over the list that they compose, and so they can compose the list in such a way that it maximizes the participation of women, of disabled people, of young people, if they want. But in other places, other than South Africa, it's tended to result in coalition governments and instability, and can lead to very fragmented party systems. And then there are mixed systems, which are different, various attempts to have the best of both worlds. You see that this is actually only there to illustrate how many different systems you could, how many different permutations you could have of those three general types. Okay. Why does this matter? Why should anyone give it a thought? And the reason why is because if you consider democracy as ruled by the people, for the people, people being able to make their own choices about who governs them, then the mechanism that is used to turn the will of the people into governance representation, that mechanism becomes really important. Because all an electoral system really is turning votes into seats. It's turning votes into power. So if you've got a presidential system, it's turning votes into presidential executive power. But a parliamentary system that we have, it's turning votes into seats. And different ways, different mechanisms for turning votes into seats can turn the same set of votes into very different seats, into very different distribution of power. And so it matters what system you use. And electoral systems had a big impact on democracy and on political systems because of the reasons set out here. Firstly, electoral systems shape political party systems in that the incentives of political participation are different depending on the electoral system that you have. And that can determine and produce variations in the number, the size, the organizational strategy, the organizational structure, the campaign strategy of different parties. It also shapes the power relationship between parties and candidates. So in South Africa and in Namibia, our proportional representation systems are quite unique in that they have yielded dominant party systems. Ordinarily, that's not supposed to happen. Where a single party, either nationally or regionally, and in South Africa, we have two dominant parties. We have the ANC, that's the dominant party nationally, and the DA is the dominant party in the Western Cape. And we've had a proportional representation system that is led to dominance, which is normally atypical. Somewhere like Israel, the Israeli government has collapsed again because somebody's pulled out of the coalition, where there's a proliferation of parties. All of them get a fraction of the vote, and then they have to cobble together coalitions. It looks like we're probably going to start seeing quite a bit of that. The one thing that we've got in South Africa that's similar to, or that makes sense from the proportional representation system, is how many political parties we have. I think last year there were 320 registered political parties for last year's elections. And that is typical of a PR system. Interestingly, like a first past the post system should lead to a smaller number of large parties. In India, they've got a proliferation of parties. And so, yeah, so sometimes things go against the rule. An electoral system serves as a tool for conflict management because it creates the structure for electoral participation. So you can have some electoral systems in particular places that exacerbate conflict, and you can have others that reduce conflict, and one of the reasons why the PR system was chosen for South Africa was exactly because of the post-conflict nature of the society. Electoral systems also influence how citizens participate and their attitudes to voting. So in general, in first past the post systems, unless people want to vote for one of the two big parties, they generally won't vote because they know that their vote won't matter. It'll be discarded if they vote for one of the smaller parties or a small candidate. So, so voters who want to support small parties generally abstain. PR should encourage political participation, but as we can see in electoral participation, as we can see in South Africa, that's not guaranteed. Then finally, electoral systems influence the development of policy by influencing who gets in and who doesn't. So the National Party in 1948 had a minority of the vote. They had less than 50% of the vote. But because of the way that the constituencies were gerrymandered, they were able to get over 50% of the seats in Parliament and take over governing the state. In South Africa, this everyone knows. So the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission, in their report, identified 4 values for South Africa's electoral system: inclusiveness, fairness, simplicity, accountability, this is basically our ballot structures that we all vote for a political party, not for individual candidates. You vote in your resident province. There's 1 national district, and then there's 9 provincial districts, and this is going to be important when we talk about the amendment bill. And this other thing that's going to be important when we talk about the amendment bill is the electoral formula that we use is that votes are converted to seats through a quota formula. And it's a quota formula called the Droop formula. Apparently it's named after the mathematician that invented it. Somebody Droop. Really unfortunate surname. But Droop quota, and basically any party that wins 0.25% of the vote can be represented in the National Assembly. Okay. Now, New Nation 2020, there were 3 judgments. There was the majority judgment written by Justice Madlanga, which was supported by 8 of the 9 judges of the Constitutional Court. There was a concurring judgment written by Justice Jafta, which was also supported by 8 of the judges. The difference between the majority judgment by Madlanga and the Jafta judgment is that the Jafta judgment delves into, so the Madlanga judgment is centered around Section 19 of the Constitution and the political rights that Section 19 grants. But it links Section 19 to Section 18, but it doesn't, which is about the right of freedom of association, but it doesn't delve deeply into Section 18. The Jafta judgment develops the arguments around Section 18. That's a difference between them, but basically they all lead to the same conclusion. There was a dissenting judgment by Justice Cronin, who did not support the amendment of the Electoral Act, and he did not support the position that the Constitution mandates individuals to contest in national and provincial elections as individuals. So just a bit of explanation about what the rights are here that are at issue, because it's going to make the criticism of the current amendment bill make a bit more sense. So, in the majority judgment, Justice Madlanga argues that although the founding provisions of the Constitution call for and I quote, a multi-party system of democratic government, this does not necessitate that the Constitution requires an exclusively party-based proportional representation system. According to Madlanga, the reference to multi-party democracy should be interpreted as an injunction that South Africa should never again become a one-party state. So the reference to multi-party in those founding provisions isn't about the system we should have, it's more a warning around becoming a one-party state, that we shouldn't become. So it then shouldn't be interpreted as the exclusion of individual candidates from contesting elections. And in fact, the local government system is consistent with that, right? So the local government provisions of the Constitution allow for either a pure proportional representation system at local government or a mixed system of constituency representation and PR. And that part of the Constitution is commonly agreed to be consistent with the provisions of the founding provisions of the Constitution. So, so that's first point that Majanga makes, and then argues that the rights in section 19 of the Constitution, so section 19 of the Constitution is headed political rights. And Majanga argues that those rights are so interconnected that you have to read them together. You can't read each of the rights. There are 3 rights that are identified in that section. You can't read them individually. You have to read them together. So the right to vote, the right to form or join a political party, the right to stand for election and if elected to take up office. All of those should be thought of as a whole, so that there's a continuum between the right to vote and the right to stand for office. That the right to vote implies the right to stand for office, right? That you should be, and all of those are political rights, they're about your political expression. And so, therefore, the argument that forcing an adult citizen to exercise their right to contest for public office by joining a political party violates the right to contest for office that is enshrined in section 19. In addition, section 18, which talks about the right to freedom of association, included with the right to associate is the right not to associate. So combined together with the right to join a political party, you have the right not to join a political party, right? So if you then read that section 19, because section 19(1) says that people have a right to form a political party, but it should also mean that people have a right not to form a political party. But their not forming a political party shouldn't prevent them from standing for office. You should be able to stand for office, regardless of whether you're part of a party or not. In other words, adult citizens should therefore not be forced to join a political party in order to exercise their constitutional right to stand for public office in national and provincial elections. An interesting point is that Majanga highlights the situation of a person called Princess Chantal Rebel of a group of the Khoisan, of a Khoi clan, who said that she, and who was part of the case, who was one of the applicants, and she said she was averse to forming or joining a political party because as a representative and leader of the Karana nation, she was reluctant to be constrained by the partisanship that comes with being a member of a political party. So she would want to represent her people in the legislature directly, not through membership of the party. Because if she was a member of the party, it would then split her allegiance. Because she had to abide by political party rules, even if those contradicted the interests of the people. And so implicit in that, I mean, Majanga doesn't say it directly, but implicit in this idea that a leader should be able to represent their people directly is constituency, right? Implicit in that is that Chantal Rebel should be able to represent her constituency directly. However it is you define that constituency. That's something important also in relation to the law. So this is also a table like that other one of all the different electoral systems. To just show you the meanders that has taken place since the 11th of June of 2020. And I want to make a point here to help you understand what this table actually means. The point I want to make here is that the Constitution gives the power to make electoral law to the National Assembly and the National Assembly alone, or to Parliament and Parliament alone. In some respects, only the National Assembly, in others, the National Assembly and the NCOP. But the only arm of the state that has got the right to make electoral policy, electoral law, is Parliament. Which is why in the judgments, it's left open-ended what the accommodation of individuals should look like. Because the Constitution respects that separation of powers, it's not the Constitutional Court's case. And we've seen that principle reaffirmed over and over and over again in jurisprudence in the court. Whether it was around party funding, whether it was around floor crossing, the court always says that any decision about electoral law must be made by Parliament. Except in this case, Parliament handed over a great deal of the power and control of this process to the Minister of Home Affairs. And having read the minutes of the committee meetings, of the Home Affairs Committee meetings that have taken place since the 25th of June of 2020, this isn't a case of the minister usurping power amid great protest by the parliamentary committee. The committee handed it over and sat back and did very little, and went with the cues of the minister. So the first meeting in Parliament around this particular legislation was on the 25th of June of 2020. Then the IEC presented again, and the IEC presented at that first meeting. The IEC presented again on the 21st of July. On the 18th of August, the committee was given options for scenarios for the amendment. And that 18th of August is the last time that the committee met on this issue in 2020. In the 25th of November, the policy adjustment was introduced to, or was discussed and agreed on by the technical team of the Justice, Corrections, Space and Police and Security Cluster. And then on the 9th of February of 2021, the minister provided a progress update and told the committee that he was appointing a committee to help him draft the legislation, which I was on, the Ministerial Advisory Committee on the electoral system. And we had our first introductory meeting with the minister on the 19th of February. We had our first substantive meeting on the 25th of February. And worked for 4 months. On the 9th of June, the MAC presented its reports to the minister. There were 2 options because there was no agreement on which one to take. And it was only on the 24th of November that Cabinet approved the electoral amendment bill. On the 10th of January of 2022, the electoral amendment bill was released to the public. was gazetted and was put onto the parliamentary website. There were public submissions open from the 21st of January to the 21st of February. There were public hearings in the National Assembly from the 1st to the 2nd of March. And then after that, I think in response to some of the submissions that were made on the 1st and 2nd of March, were that because this is legislation that affects the provinces, the committee had to do public consultation in all 9 provinces. And so that was hurriedly put together, and you had that go on for the rest of March. And presumably after the recess, there will now be a debate in the committee about the actual legislation. But as you can see, the process has been quite hurried as far as Parliament is concerned, and there's been very limited public hearing and submission and public engagement of this. The Ministerial Advisory Committee, we did have public consultations. I think we had them twice. We had them over 2 days and opened up to organizations that wanted to or individuals that wanted to speak. And we justified the limitation of those consultations because we said, well, we're not the main act. The Ministerial Advisory Committee isn't the one responsible for making the law. We're advising the minister on how to do a draft, but the main act is in Parliament, and that's where the big public debate should be taking place. Clearly, that hasn't happened. The committee has agreed that the speaker should ask for an extension because they won't be done by the 10th of June of 2022, so that there should be an extension requested from the Constitutional Court. But that extension is really to wrap up the process that's currently underway. It's not to broaden it. So briefly on the Ministerial Advisory, so yeah, I'm going to go because I'd like to open up to questions. The Ministerial Advisory Committee report, there were 2 options, and basically we were divided. So initially, no best laid plans, great hopes, was that we would agree. We'd come to an agreement. Let me just say that the Ministerial Advisory Committee was chaired by Mr. Bali Musa, who he was former Minister of Constitutional Affairs, and the other members of the committee were Advocate Tanzi Tlakula, who's the former chairperson of the IEC, Advocate Vincent Maleka, who's senior counsel for Joburg Bar, Dr. Mike Sutcliffe, who's a former member of the Municipal Demarcations Board and former eThekwini municipal manager, Dr. Nomsa Masuku, who's a commissioner of the Electoral Commission of South Africa, me, Mr. Norman du Plessis, who's former IEC Deputy Chief Elections Officer, and Prof. Darrell Glazer, who's HOD of the Politics Department. And when it came then, so when it was clear that we weren't going to agree on what to do, we decided to present our disagreement to the minister. And there were 2 options. Dr. Masuku, it was agreed that she elected not to participate in voting for one or the other option because she has to administer whatever system as a commissioner of the IEC. She's responsible for administering whatever system she's presented with, and so it wasn't appropriate for her to weigh in on either of these. 3 of the members of the committee, Advocate Tlakula, Mr. du Plessis, and Dr. Sutcliffe, opted for what they call a modified mixed member constituency system, a slightly modified mixed member constituency system, which is basically the current system that we have. And remember I said that in our current system, you think of it being like 10 districts or 10 constituencies, the nation and the 9 provinces. So they say 10 constituencies, and then what you must do is that, and already in the National Assembly elections, parties produce 2 lists. They produce a national list of 200 names, and then they produce a regional list of 200 names. And the names that are on the regional list are people that will represent a province, and the distribution of that 200 is determined by the population size of each province, right? So the people that represent Gauteng, there's more of them than the people that represent Northern Cape, right? And the distribution of seats after voting is done is drawn from both the national and from the regional list, right? According to how a party does in the region and in each province versus national. So what they propose is adding independent candidates to the regional lists, okay? So each independent candidate will run in the region that they are registered to vote in. So, I saw Zulus and Xhosas are fighting over black coffee. But let's say he decides that he's from Transkei, he wasn't touched. So black coffee would be, and he wanted to run as an independent. We vote for him because of the Grammy. He would run in the Eastern Cape list. Musi Maimane would run in the Gauteng list. Indima Zibuko, I suppose, would run in the KZN list because she's from there. See, that's how it's thought of. So that's how you do it in the regional list. The rest of us, so me, Prof. Glaser, Vali Musa, and Advocate Malika, said that defeats the purpose of the judgment. Because, and it doesn't lead to meaningful participation of independent candidates. Because the judgment, as I've said earlier, was not only about being able to exercise your political right of contesting an election as an individual, but it's also about the representation of direct constituencies. And so this tagging on independence doesn't really make sense. Our second disagreement with this, and I think it's Prof. Glaser who wrote extensively about this on the committee and as kind of political scientist, is that that's not what proportional representation means. PR systems are about the contestation of organizations, of corporatized entities that are made up of many individuals, and then deciding which of the individuals in an entity will be representatives according to how much of support each entity has. So to try and treat organizations like individuals, it's apples and bananas. Because in that distribution of proportions of votes, there's only one individual. So if they get a proportion of the vote that allows them to have 5 seats, where do those 4 seats go? There are cases where you've got proportional systems where individuals are running against each other. You can do that. And those are ranked systems. So somebody will vote for, you'll say who you want to occupy a position the most, who your second choice is, who your third choice is. And so when somebody gets the most first choice votes, they get a seat. And then all of their other votes are given to the second choice, etc. You can do that. But to treat parties like individuals in the same system on the same ballot doesn't actually make sense theoretically, and as we'll see, it doesn't make sense numerically either. So what we recommended was that given the time constraints, and of course the argument for this option one was that there's no time. And you need an electoral system that is going to abide by the judgment and that people will be able to understand quickly and that can be implemented quickly. And so we said, well, we already have a model for that system in the local government. At local government level, we already have a mixed member system where there's single member constituencies at ward level that use a first past the post. And then there are proportional representation lists, votes, and the proportional representation ballot. And we said we can adapt, and in municipalities, half of the seats are ward and half of the seats are PR, are the compensatory PR. So we said you can just apply that system nationally and provincially. And you can demarcate the wards or the constituencies, the 200, within the boundaries that we already have of the district and of the local municipalities. And so that would, so an illustration of what that would look like. So the city of Johannesburg is one district, right? But within the city of Johannesburg, there are multiple regions. So you could have each of those regions be able to vote. Each of those regions could have its own seat in parliament. And people be able to vote for a region, for a representation, a representative of their particular region. The difference that we proposed in that option 2 from the local government system is that the PR vote would not be a compensatory one. So right now, the votes that are cast in the wards are included in the calculation of the PR allocation of municipalities, which is why you've got parties that will have the same person on the ballot for 50 wards, knowing that that person won't get elected in any of those wards, but whatever votes that party gets is going to contribute to the overall distribution of seats. We said that actually distorts proportionality, and so you should have them as separate votes. So the ward votes only count for the ward, for the constituency allocation who wins and loses, and then the PR is calculated separately. We also proposed that you, or suggested that you could have, and Parliament consider, having a right of recall. Basically, that a vacancy can occur in a constituency in a number of ways. Someone can resign, someone can die. Someone can be, if they're party representative, they can be fired by their party. We said there must be a fourth option that can be that at different points within an electoral term, the constituency, through X number of signatures, whatever, can vote to recall that person and then trigger a by-election. The electoral amendment bill is based on option 1. And basically, it does that thing, it applies the closest PR system to parties and individuals, and it treats the provinces as constituencies, also in regions, and it divides the National Assembly seats. So 200 of them are regional, and 200 of them are PR, or national, or compensatory. Independents can only compete for the regional seats. And the seats are allocated, the votes are distributed on 3 rounds, and I'll explain what that means now. So basically, independents can only compete for half of the seats in the National Assembly. So, and this is where it gets, I was brainstorming last night with my partner about how do I explain this in a simple way. He had the whole idea about thinking about it as a champagne fountain. I was like, that's not how champagne fountains work. So I'm going to try and explain it in my own way. So currently, and I want to thank Michael Atkins, whose name I spoken correctly, Michael Atkins, who's a freelance elections analyst, done a lot of crunching. He released a paper on this, and so I've taken these numbers from his paper, which is over there. I'll share it with the organizers of this event so that they can share it with all of you. So the current way that the calculation is made is that this formula of Mr. Drew says that the total number of votes that are cast, or valid votes that are cast in an election, is divided by the number of seats available plus 1. Remember your bod mass, bomb dust, whatever. So that total number of valid votes divided by seats plus 1, and whatever number comes out of there plus 1, and there'll be a fraction, and so you disregard the fraction. The reason for the plus 1s in the denominator and on the other side is because it is you can't have a fraction of a seat, right? You can't have half a seat. In Zulu, like you can't have that. So it is to create whole numbers, basically, to allow for a whole seat, right? So plus 1 seat. So what it looks like is if you use the numbers from the 2019 election, there were 17 million valid votes, 400 seats. So the quota, the number of votes you needed to get a seat was 43,485. Okay. And the way that those are distributed, that the seats are distributed, is that first the IEC distributes it works out what the calculation is according to the quota, so that's 17 million divided by the 433,000, and then where there are remainders, those excess votes are then divided, or those excess fractions, those remainders are turned into seats. The seats that are left over are distributed amongst the parties according to the highest remainder in the calculation. So if through the calculation, the first allocation, the good has 1.876 seats. The PAC, God bless, are they still there? Has 0.67 seats. Has 0.67. The good will get an extra seat because it's got that 0.8. Their remainder is higher than that of the PAC. That was better than champagne cocktail, but it gets worse. Now, the first thing is that under the current, so these numbers were for the 2019 election, right? So this was the distribution of seats nationally with that 400 seats, okay? And that's the quota that was required. If you use the same calculation and you apply it to the available seats in the provinces, the available regional seats, that 200 regional seats, the quota to get a regional seat is higher than the quota to get a national seat. So the quotas here, 77,000, for example, to get a seat in the, you need 77,000 votes to get the regional seat, a regional seat of the Eastern Cape in the legislature, in the National Assembly. You need 92,000 votes to get a regional seat of Gauteng in the National Assembly. Gauteng has the most regional seats. And so on and so forth. Now, the implication of that is that if you are going to say that independent candidates can only contest for regional seats, it means that the parties can contest both for the national and for the regional. It means that independent candidates need, in some cases, double the votes that a party gets to have a chance of being represented in the National Assembly. And so that's the first issue. So this here comes from the Electoral Act itself. Electoral Amendment Bill. Okay. So Schedule 1A of the Electoral Amendment Bill sets out the details of the system. And it says that the votes will be allocated over 3 rounds. The first and the second round only apply to independent candidates. So first you allocate the seats to independent candidates. And then in the third round is when you apply the seats to political parties. And you use a different quota formula for the first 2 rounds to the one that you use in the third round. And so and it's bizarre because the quota formula that is used or that is proposed to be used in round 1 and in round 2 is not the Droop formula that is used for round 3. And the thing about the Droop formula, and the reason why we use it, remember earlier on, I said that our proportional representation system is made to get as many, to give you as big a chance as possible to getting a seat in Parliament. So the Droop formula works out the minimum number of votes that you would need to get a seat. And that's why it's beneficial then for small parties. That benefit is not given to independents in the bill. So it is possible, and Mike Atkins does this in his paper, I haven't put it in here. It is possible, and if you run models using the numbers of the 2019 election, it is possible for an independent candidate to get 3 times, 10 times the number of votes, or to get 3 times, not 10. It's possible for an independent candidate to get 3 times the number of votes that a small party does, and not get a seat in Parliament, but that small party get a seat in Parliament. Because of the way in which the allocations are done. I mean, an important thing to remember here also is that, if you'll notice there when you see the round 1, it's the total number of votes in the region over the total number of seats allocated to that region. By round 2, you've got a smaller number of votes in the region, because you take out the distribution or the independents that have gotten the votes of the independents that have gotten seats in round 1. And then it's a smaller number of total seats because you minus the seats that are allocated to the independents in round 1 and 2. 3, you've taken away the votes that were given to independents, and you've subtracted the number of seats that have been allocated to independent candidates. So political parties are then competing numerically much more favorably by that third calculation than the independent candidates that have been calculated for in round 1. Because there's no, and because the number on the top and the denominator, I just forgot what the number on the top is called in mathematical terms, but the number at the top and the number at the bottom don't reduce proportionally, right? So you can have a completely skewed set of numbers by the time you get to that third round. An illustration of what this would mean is that for an independent candidate, in KZN, for example, they would require 89,000 votes with the formula that's there for round 1, compared to requiring 86,000 votes if you use the fifth vote. So it caused a lot of unhappiness, obviously. There's a lot of other criticism of the bill, which I'll get to. In the public hearings, these were the organizations and one individual that made submissions at the hearings. The only one of those organizations that supported the bill is COSATU. Everybody else disagreed with it. A point I have not made yet, which I have to, is that Musiwa Lekota of COPE actually initiated an electoral reform discussion by submitting a private member's bill to amend the Electoral Act in February of 2020. So this is before the judgment. And that private member's bill was a modification of the Van Zyl-Slabbert recommendations from 2003. The parliamentary committee accepted it, said we're going to discuss it. And of course, Parliament went on to recess for a long time with COVID. Then after the New Nation judgment, they said, no, we will discuss it, we will discuss it. Then they were going to discuss it again in 2021. In February of 2022, the Parliamentary Home Affairs Committee released a statement that they decided that it was not appropriate to discuss the private members' bill submitted by the Zerpa. So the people that disagree, so these organizations that don't support the bill, there's a variety of options that they put on the table. Some of those organizations said that the option that should be discussed and should be worked out is the Ministerial Advisory Committee option. Others supported some version of the Lekota bill. Others supported something else completely. So the summary of the criticisms that were presented is that firstly, as we saw with those numbers, is that the bill creates an unequal basis of competition between independent candidates and political parties. Independents only contest 200 seats. There are different formulas used. Those 3 rounds, it's not actually clear what the point is and why there's 2 rounds that apply to independents and only one that applies to parties. The argument here also was that it distorts proportional representation because there are wasted votes. And one of the things that's enshrined in our constitution is the equality of votes. No one's vote should matter more than anyone else. And that is within reason, right? So, because math is imperfect, there are some calculations that will mean that there will be some wastage of votes here and there. But overall, every vote should have the chance to matter. In this bill, what you have is the deliberate creation of a system where some votes matter more than others. And where you can have the really odd situation where an independent candidate can have a huge amount of support in a particular region, but a smaller party can get in. What happens to those wasted votes, by the way, is that those wasted votes don't go to another independent. They're allocated amongst the parties, with the bias being towards the bigger parties. It limits constituency accountability. It undermines the substantive participation of independents. When we embarked on the Ministerial Advisory Committee process, one of the principles that we added to those that come from the Van Zyl-Slavic process was that there should be meaningful participation of independents. It must be substantive. Under this bill, that doesn't happen. And then a big criticism was the limitation of public consultations. And in several of the submissions, the argument was that this is artificial urgency that's been created. That Parliament could have started dealing with this on the 12th of June of 2020. That this delayed process now, where you need to go through the entire parliamentary process, and remember, this is a Section 76 bill, which means that it has implications for both national and provincial. So it needs to be discussed by both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. And a lot of the submissions said, trying to do all of that in 6 months is a self-created crisis. It didn't have to be that. So my concluding thoughts with all of this is that we need an active, large-scale civic movement on electoral reform. In other countries that have embarked on electoral reform like this, it's been done through a referendum. The public is involved. The problem with having this elite chop and change is that then you get yourself into a situation like Lesotho, where after every election, the elites want to change the electoral system. And what occupies the political elite is electoral competition and isn't actually delivering to the people that vote for them and that they govern. And we have precedent for having big movements around legislation. The Right to Know campaign, which I worked on, is one. That protection of state information bill is still in a cupboard in the presidency. Goodness knows what's going to happen to it. The traditional courts bill had a huge campaign against it in its original form, and there's continuing civic activity around it. Poppy Act. The Poppy Act, as it was introduced into Parliament in 2009, something very different to the legislation that we're all needing to abide by because of an active movement against it. So we have precedent for it and we need to do it. The second is that academics need to think creatively about how to comprehensively redesign our electoral system for the long term. As I showed in that slide, there are so many different permutations. And because of the constraints of needing to work within these timelines after the Crown Court judgment, I don't think that we've maximized the permutations of how do we think about what would proper representation be in this country. And part of thinking that, and that's my third point, is that any effort must have people under 35 at the center. Because they were the ones who are going to use the system. And as we can see, the present system is not going to keep being used for much longer. Because the demographic that should be using it doesn't believe in it. So we need to have whatever system we're going to have needs to have at the center the people that are going to be alive. I mean, nuclear war and environmental apocalypse notwithstanding, right? Like all sorts of things could kill all of us in the next 10 years. But the people that have the best chance of being alive are not the people that have been involved in this discussion. And I want to end with something that came out of the Kazakh submission. And they say we would urge Parliament to consider that designing an electoral system is not just for the next election or even for the one after that. It is indeed a rare opportunity for societies to reassess such a fundamental mechanism around which any democracy pivots. It is therefore necessary to consider the long-term sustainability and effectiveness of an electoral system. It should be a system that harnesses and deepens the democratic culture in society. Thank you.
Many thanks, Sithembile, for that fascinating and some will say very complex, but you managed to reduce a huge amount of complexity into understandable form and also provide us with an insight into, as you said at the end, such a pressing and important matter. So we're open to the floor and we have two floors, as it were. We have the people here and we have those online. And so what I'm going to do is just first of all start with those here. There are one or two questions and pass the mic around and then ask Candace to tell me if there are any online and we can take one or two there and see how we go. We only have until 2 o'clock. So anybody in the room? Wow, 2 already. Introduce yourselves, please.
This is working. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aisha Omar from the Political Studies Department. Thank you for that really fascinating talk, Sithembile. I'm ashamed to say I haven't been following a lot of these developments and discussions around electoral reform, so you really educated me this afternoon. So my question is probably actually comes back to right to the beginning of the talk, which is trying to conceptualize the good life. And the political theorist in me is intrigued by your use of the term good life, which many of us know in his genealogical origins finds expression in the Aristotelian notion of the good life. For Aristotle, that was the highest activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, as my first year students know. But the good life is essentially a teleological formulation. And again, it was part of this idea of the end goal of a process. And when I was thinking about your talk and many of the kind of complexities around democracy and democratization in the post-colonial state, the idea of this teleological formulation prompted me to consider whether the kinds of sort of issues that you're picking up on with regards to electoral politics and representative democracy is perhaps located in this notion of, or this kind of collective notion that we all have of democracy as a teleological formulation. And by this, I'm talking about this idea that seems to be so rooted in our understanding that democratization is this kind of unidirectional process from authoritarianism towards a representative government, and that there's certain kinds of stages that we need to or specific set of identifiable stages that, including electoral reform, by the way, that we need to follow in order to achieve this representative and accountable government. And so as a consequence, the post-colonial state in Africa, where we've seen democratic regression, actually gives us a far more complex story. And so sort of just, in other words, what I'm trying to ask is, do you think that this teleological formation is the problem, that this idea of democratization in our collective consciousness in this teleological way is what needs to be reimagined, so that we can start reimagining every other part of democracy, including electoral reform? Sorry for the long question.
Do you want to take that alone?
Thanks so much. That was a fabulous presentation. My name is Nicole Beardsworth. I'm a lecturer in politics at Wits. So I have a couple of questions which were a bit more in the weeds, but one comment that I had is that I think you're right that this is something that all South Africans should be deeply concerned about. Looking through the Afrobarometer's latest report, I think South Africa, despite being the 5th highest ranked liberal democracy on the African continent, is 5th lowest in terms of our belief in democracy. We're just, I think, behind or just above, I think it was Morocco and Egypt, if I'm not mistaken. So people don't really believe in the system, and I think that's absolutely crucial. So I have a couple of questions on that. Sorry, getting nervous. My question about that is, what else should we do alongside electoral reform? Because electoral reform is crucial, but it is clearly not the only intervention that we need here. The second questions that I had were related to some specifics about the proposed bill. So it said on your slide that the Northern Cape has the highest number of regional seats at 55.
No.
Okay, I saw Northern Cape, so maybe that was an error. Great, good to get that clarified. And then secondly, the other question.
It should be 5.
Okay, great. I was gonna say that makes no sense. There's, yeah, tiny number of people. The second question that I had was with regards to the regional seats. How is it determined in which region one stands? Does it have to be the region that you're from, or is it the region that you live in? This is obviously important from a migration perspective. In South Africa, we know we have really high rates of domestic migration. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm going to answer the second set of questions because it's easier, and then I'm going to answer Aisha's questions. Thanks, Nicole. So look, so I've previously written that electoral reform is actually the least of our worries. What I've previously always said is that for me, the weakest link in our democratic system is political parties. And the thing that people don't trust is political parties. I mean, the motivation for the New Nation movement court case in the first place was a lack of trust in existing political parties and a lack of trust in what happens to political activists when they organize as a political party. So it was wanting to create a means to political participation, to political contestation that circumvents political parties, because parties themselves are seen as the problem. And it's interesting, I've had very fascinating debates with the people who are involved in New Nation, lots of really great conversations. But where I say, well, even if it's a citizens movement, I mean, they can just register as a party with the IEC. Like, no, parties, once you call yourself a party, is a problem. And there should be a way for people to nominate people to stand for election without those people needing to organize themselves in a party. Basically, is the. And so, and I think that we think and we talk too little about our political parties. In legal terms, political parties are a club. So there's general requirements, like the sort of a deed of formation and a list of people that say that they belong to the party, that the IEC has in the Electoral Commission Act. But otherwise, it's completely open, and the name, and there's particular requirements around naming conventions. But otherwise, it's pretty open. How a political party organizes itself, how it runs, what its constitution looks like, how often it holds internal elections, what input its branch members or its general membership has into leadership, into policy questions, is completely up to the party. We know more about JSE listed companies and their internal workings than we do about the internal workings of political parties. If I want to know how much the CEO of Anglo American earns, I can look it up. That information is publicly available. I mean, I now know how much Bilateral earns as the president of the Women's League because we're to court. But I don't know how much Paul Mashatile earns, for example. Or for that matter, how much Helen Ziller earns as the whatever she is at the DA. And so we have this curious legal and democratic conundrum where the entities that contest for public power are not subject to our rules about the exercise of public power until they are in office. And what we know about how those entities operate before they come into office, or even while they are holding power, it's actually really limited. And I think that's a problem. I think that the reason why people don't believe in democracy is that they don't believe in political parties. And that's been the only mechanism through which people can engage in democracy. There are options to kind of have, and I know my vote counts hosted a conversation about this last year, about, should we think of having some legislation to regulate how political parties operate? Germany, Mexico have that kind of legislation. Other people say no, but I think so many of our reforms need to be centered on parties and how we think of parties. What are they for? How do they operate? Yeah, so that would be my thing. And then, of course, there are other more kind of technocratic things, like I think that there needs to be a lot more investment in the IEC for it to be able to do its job properly. We have a serious problem with civic education, and not just voter education, but civic education. People don't understand what this is, how the system works as a whole. Something that I'm working on at the moment actually is to try and develop a civic education platform, a comprehensive one. And then finally, is that on paper, like most things, on paper, South Africa has the most expansive system of participatory democracy. On paper, citizens are not just supposed to, or voters are not just supposed to participate at each election. There are all sorts of opportunities for engagement. So with IDP processes at local government level, ward committees, with different legislative processes at provincial and at national, people just don't know about it. And so actually activating those systems of participatory democracy, I think would be really so Aisha, that is such an important enlightening point. Like I've had a whole aha moment around that theology. And you're spot on, right? And the reason why I use kind of Aristotle formulation is, if you think about our constitution and constitutional provisions around dignity, there's so much about the way in which democratic life in a democratic South Africa is envisioned in terms of these virtues. And yet we haven't, though that structure and in the structure within which we live are completely opposed, right? You can't fulfill those virtues in the way that our economy and our institutions are structured. So that's why I've always, you know, that language and that formulation. But I think the point that you're making is completely spot on. But this idea of what's that civilizational notion of democracies is, or as growing from childhood, from babies to adulthood and maturing. And then once you're mature forever. Is just looking at the world shows that's just not true. And not just at post-colonial Africa, in Eastern Europe, in the United States itself, in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, in Latin America, throughout the whole of Latin America, that idea that there is this linear development towards some end is just false. And the reality is that it's much more, I don't know if it's sort of squiggly. These constant squiggles, you know, you go around, sometimes you're going up and sometimes you're going down, and then you go around to the same place. And I think what's central to that is that democracy takes effort. It's a constant struggle and it needs to be chosen every day. And in the same way people can choose democracy, they can choose not to have democracy, even in a system that used to be democratic. Yeah, and I agree that that teleological framework is perhaps. Should we take anything online? No.
Nothing online. One minute.
Good day, everyone. My name is Sithembile Mbete. I studied politics and IR. I'm currently studying law. This is my final year. It's nice to meet you, Dr. Mbete. I always see you on News Africa. So I took two questions for you. I saw that we have a serious problem here in South Africa from the age of 18 and 35, that people, they don't vote. And for the first time in our local government elections, those are the ones who never voted, right? And I saw in your conclusion of thought, you said that like, those are the people that they must be in the center to reform the electoral system. So my question is that how can we motivate them? How can we inspire them? How can we educate them? How can we enlighten them? Because of the majority of the population of our country, right? And the second question is that the more people they don't vote, that brings coalition governments. And we know coalition governments in Africa, they bring instability, but like at countries like Germany, they don't bring instability. So how can we prevent that? How can we avoid that? Those are my two questions. Thank you so much.
Excellent. On the first one is to go where young people organize. I think there's a lot of, in the way that a lot of these participatory processes are designed, is that you should be speaking to young people at sports fields and in, you know, whatever club they are running. That's where so much of the way in which we've organized and the way in which we formalize our participation processes is that it is only those organizations that are about social justice or that are about politics or that are about democracy that contribute. And that's not how, I mean, even in the sort of the Western, the Lipsitz and the River, that's not how democratic participation should work. Is it the bowling club, the soccer team, the women's manano, the youth debating team, the dance squad, all of those people should have a say in the democratic decisions of a country. it shouldn't be limited to the Kazakhs and the, the outers and the whatever of the world. And the problem is that because we only make participation accessible to those kinds of organizations, we don't reach the people that are not part of those organizations. And if you think of the UDF, right, like the work that Prof. Mazingozi has done on the UDF, so many of the member organizations of the UDF weren't, and also because they couldn't, it was difficult to start one and to sustain one in the repressive environment, weren't political organizations. It was women's feeding, women's organizations that were feeding starving children. And school organizations of school kids teaching each other. And those were all the composite units that made up the UDF. And that brought about a huge political change in the country in the 1980s. Yeah, so that's where I would start. And then the second thing around the why coalitions are not stable is because in places like Germany, Denmark, and my favorite series is Borgen on Netflix. Fascinating. And it's based in Denmark. It's a fictional thing about a Danish prime minister, a woman. And is that in those countries, they have mechanisms, because they chose proportional representation systems because of coalition government, because they wanted to create coalitions. And so they've created an infrastructure that supports coalitions. They have dispute mechanisms, dispute resolution mechanisms around coalitions. They have mechanisms for the state to keep running while coalitions are being negotiated. So this current German coalition, I mean, they even have names for it. Like this one is it's a robot, it's a traffic light coalition. It's the reds, the greens, and the yellows or oranges. It's their colors. That was one of the shortest coalition governments to be put together in Germany. It took only 4 months. It can take up to a year. But there's an infrastructure for the states to function, and it's an accepted, known part of the system, and it's managed accordingly. Of course, not all countries that have this kind of system always have the institutions that manage those systems work differently, work better in some cases than others. So in Italy, there's a long period that they're not working very well at all. But the point is that I'm making is still that in those places, because they know that coalition is a part of the system, they have an entire infrastructure to support. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Thabo Lishido from the Conversation Africa. I have a slightly different take on why it's difficult to get young people interested. When in practice, your average age to be a minister has to be about 60 or 65. And then our politics is basically run by old quotas. We have the golden oldie to make it. I mean, we have to be from exile and feel entitled to being rewarded for even allegedly freed people. And then the young people who actually getting shot in the 80s and actually really helped to bring down the system, don't make it into positions, cannot be a minister. Right, so I'm just wondering what effect that has. Or if you're a young person, I mean, people can come to you in a soccer field or at a party and say, let's go and take part in politics. But when they look and say, I'm not as old as Naredi Pando and these other people, that, it's not gonna work for you. I think there's a practical problem. And it's also very, very difficult for young people to actually have senior positions in political parties because of the golden oldies.
Indeed, and I think that that's part of one of the implications of this of the new nation judgment around that section on political rights is this idea that the flip side of being able to vote is being able to stand for election. And what we've got for young people is an expectation for them to vote, but real barriers to entry for them being the ones who are going to stand. I mean, even with the ANC, the electoral conference is going to take place at the end of the year. The NEC still has a requirement that you need to have been a member of the party for how many years in order to be voted onto the NEC. And so that automatically disqualifies people below a certain age. And so, yes, so the idea that if you, a democracy, for a democracy to be healthy, the majority of people in that democracy must feel that they can be a candidate as much as they are the ones who are participating in voting. And we don't have that in our system. Completely right. And part of what this electoral reform process could correct is exactly that. And that's why I was calling for kind of some creativity and thinking by academics about what could be the mechanisms for entry into political contestation. If we say that parties are a problem, but of course also having individuals and independents can also be a problem because those people aren't accountable to anyone. So what other kinds of formations, what other kind of mechanisms can you have? Do you need to think about quotas, right? So there's countries on the continent, and Namibia does, that have seats set aside for young people, seats set aside for women. How do we make contestation meaningful? And it's a question not just for South Africa, but the continent. African continent median age is 19. The average age of an African president, I think, is 65. So yeah, so I take that completely. And I guess the big question for us as we have this debate and as we move forward, if we've decided that it's a good thing to have a democracy, right? And to maintain democratic government, if we want that, then we need to think in very considered and deliberate ways about what infrastructure is going to support that. Because we inherited an infrastructure from Odessa that wasn't supposed to be used after 1994. The electoral system in the Constitution is under the heading of the section is transitional arrangements. Our electoral system was not meant to be used beyond 1994. The Constitution didn't deal with it, the Constitution of 1996, so it put the transitional arrangement for 1999. But the idea was that 1999 was going to be the last election where we used a closed-list proportional system. Because it was for a particular moment, a particular purpose. And now we're still using it. And it's completely inappropriate and inadequate. And it's actually, I think, continued use of it in its current form is dangerous. Because it's a one-way route to disgruntlement and authoritarianism. And so we really need to harness this moment to think about it.
Thank you so much, Sithembile. I think that's a great place to end. I think what we've heard so excellently put is both some hope and also a great deal of tragedy, if you want. The hope for me is that an idea was put before the courts, and people, including yourself, took it in another direction towards something more serious, as in a proper electoral reform. And the tragedy, and maybe you can give a quick answer to this before we end, is that it seems to have led nowhere, right? So am I right in sort of summarizing what you said by saying that those that want the least change have won the argument?
Yes.
So, yeah, so
At
that
the moment.
at the
But
moment,
you don't have to win it forever,
right.
which is why I decided to talk about this here today.
Fantastic.
To salvage some.
Fantastic. It has been really fascinating, and I couldn't agree more that it's a vital and an important thing to carry forward. So all of you out there, carry forward the message and join me in thanking Sithembile. Thanks all.